So I'm delighted to welcome Professor David Gilchrist, who is joining us from the University of Western Australia. And, you know, I was delighted to be introduced to David by actually the previous director of CVSL, Carol, before she handed over to me. So we have had a chat with him, and hopefully the technology will not let us down. So without further ado, David, over to you, and looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. And the theme of a presentation is myths and misunderstandings derailing non-profit effectiveness. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Fidel, and I hope everyone can hear me, and can they see my slides as well? Hopefully, yeah. I've got a thumbs up, so you can hear me.
We can hear you, David. Yes, please proceed.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. The technology is a little bit slow. It's got to come a long way. Look, thank you very much to the Voluntary Sector Leadership Centre for Voluntary Sector, at Open University. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak today. And I guess looking at the agenda and the topics that are being discussed, I wanted to take a little bit of a tangent or digression, but from our perspective here in Australia, I think a really important one, because we have some very significant policy and practice crises operating in this country as a result primarily of economic outcomes. But I think those outcomes have been exacerbated by the myths and misunderstandings that surround this sector. And at the Centre for Public Value here at the University of Western Australia, our focus is very much on understanding the macroeconomics and the macro operations of the human services sector primarily. So we have a real interest in the way not-for-profits and charities operate in this country, but we also have a very significant understanding and appreciation of the government's impact on that. And so to that extent, I wanted to spend a little bit of time today looking at some of the myths and misunderstandings that effectively derail the policy and practice framework that our human services organisations operate in. I certainly don't purport to speak for the UK, but I'd be very happy in both the question time and also outside of session to have questions or comments in relation to the UK environment, because I think there are many, of course, aspects historically in terms of policy and politics that are very similar between our two countries. But I do think that there's a real opportunity for collaboration and for learning between our two countries to enhance both the policy frameworks, but also our understanding of the way the sector operates in both those environments. So first and foremost, as I said, I'm really interested in an Australasian perspective. So when we think about the sector here at a macro level, we think about Australia, New Zealand, and also some of the developed countries within the Southeast Asian and broader Asian region. For two reasons, I guess. One is because we are good at collaborating and we enjoy learning from each other, but also because at the end of the day, we have quite a significant investment into South Asia, Southeast Asia, and broadly East Asia from Australia. And so the opportunity to be able to work in those countries is also very valuable to the sector. The other thing that I would say in terms of my Australasian perspective is that the Centre for Public Value, I think very similarly to your centre there at the Open University, is that we are very focused not just on academic outcomes, but rather how we take the evidence and convert that to policy that works. And so to that extent, we have what we call industry-ready outputs. We focus not on journal articles, but on how we can actually build tools and capacity and understanding in order that governments and the not-for-profit sector are able to operate at a much more effective level. So to that extent, today, I really want to look at the macro perspective, and the way we analyse the macro perspective that is, how does the system hang together, is that we look at the service mix, and we think the service mix is the crucible for understanding what is needed within the community and then what's actually provided within the community. And I have to say, in the Australian context, this is not very transparent at all. So we have governments that don't really want to know what the level of need is within the community, and I don't mean demand, and I'm very happy to talk about those two things in the Q&A time if that's of value to people. But at the end of the day, I think we don't have transparency over what the need is and how, to what extent that need is actually addressed in our human services programs. I also want to make an ambit claim for what we would determine to be sustainability. And when we talk about microeconomics or the micro sector, the individual departments that provide funding to the sector or procure services, and the individual organisations that provide those services, often we think about sustainability in the context of the organisation still being here tomorrow and still operating. Our bar for sustainability is a little higher than that, in that we believe that a system is sustainable when it continues to provide the right quantity of services in the right quality and with the right timing. So a sustainable sector delivers predictable and necessary appropriate levels of services to meet the need that has been identified. We're not really interested in whether individual charities or not-for-profits are surviving or not surviving. We're interested in whether the sector and the system is actually working. To that extent, then, if we think of focusing on sustainability in the service mix, we're thinking about macro versus microeconomics and how that actually impacts this sector in terms of some of the things that we do in this country and some of the things that we should do. To that extent, then, I have essentially three propositions that I want to set up my discussion by exposing to you. And the first one is that we don't really know the sector system. Again, I reiterate that I'm worried about Australia and New Zealand, the Australasian sector, but at the end of the day, we don't really know the sector system and how it operates. We have for 30 or 40 years in this country, after the establishment of the welfare state following World War II, really focused on individual programs of service and individual organisations, not how they all stick together. This has become, I guess, a really urgent issue for many in the sector in Australia, because we've had a very significant economic impact on the sector in terms of our ability to operate in very, very high CPI environments. So costs are extrapolating very, very quickly in Australia, but also because our sector competes against the mining sector for staff. And we have generally in Australia a very, very significant workforce issue, and particularly in low-paid workforces like those that provide human services. So the not-for-profit and charitable sector is the by far and away the least expensive sector to operate in the Australian economy, and that's reflected in the lack of staff that are actually incentivised to come across to that sector, particularly when we talk about mining and competition with mining. The second proposition, as you can see here, is that service users are actually the shock absorbers for system failure. And this is a really driving motivation that we have in our centre, and which many of my colleagues have in Australia, where we're looking to create a sustainable system in order to prevent those service users from having to absorb the shocks of changes in services and drop-aways in services, so unsustainable services. At the end of the day, our focus is on what the outcome is for those service users, the people that rely on services and supports to be able to live their life. Proposition 3 then, and I'm talking fast, I know, because I've got only 30 minutes to present all of this stuff and there's quite a bit to talk about. But proposition 3, as you can see there, I think is a fairly straightforward one and a fairly obvious one in many respects. But one of the things that we don't do in this country is collect sufficient and appropriate data assets to be able to understand and undertake a deep analysis of the way the system is operating or not operating, what the good things are and what the bad things are. But most importantly, we don't have any transparency over the targets that we might have and for which we might deploy the system. So in other words, taxpayers' dollars aren't married up with targets. Now, this is a particular issue in the Australian context, but in the New Zealand context, they do have and have had targets for a number of years, and that makes a significant difference in terms of the ability of governments to prioritise particular issues and to ensure that the sector is fully able to follow up on what those issues might be, but more importantly, to be assessed in terms of their outcomes. And so to that extent, the outcomes and targets and outcomes rather are critical for understanding sustainable policy and practice and for informing that policy and practice going forward. So what does all of that have to do with myths and misunderstandings? And I think this is a really important couple of points that I want to make now, because they will hopefully contextualise and make obvious why I'm making the statements and making the narrative that I'm presenting to you today. But essentially, as I mentioned before, Australia established a welfare state very similar to that of the UK following the finalisation of World War II. And we had a Labor government for the subsequent 5 or so years following the 1945 end of World War II, and that Labor government really pursued a lot of the policies and practices that were developed out of the Beveridge Report and other sources of the UK environment. What didn't happen, though, was that there weren't sufficient systems and capacity set up to be able to understand that system. And so as a result of the very gradual development of the welfare system in this country, we had a number of myths and misunderstandings built in to the way we develop our policy processes. And I wanted to explore some of those myths and misunderstandings to give you a little bit of a view as to what kind of impacts they really do have on policies in the Australian context, and then to talk about some of the things that we need to do to be able to improve that outcome. And I guess then to try and articulate that into the general agenda of the conference, I'm really arguing that without those data assets, without the deep analysis and the transparency at a system level, it's very, very difficult to achieve collaborative outcomes at a local or a individual organisational level, because the system is always going to push against what is happening at that local level. So to that extent, what are some of the, or rather, how does this system sit together? What is it that's going on in relation to the Australian not-profit and charitable human services system? Well, the way it tends to work is that there are myths that have been created, and this example, I think, is fairly straightforward and probably pertains to the UK environment as well. But we have quite a significant misunderstanding in this country that people would expect non-profit organisations or charities not to make a profit. And that myth has quite significant and often unintended consequences. It's out of sheer ignorance about the sector that people make these kinds of comments. But at the end of the day, those myths create cultural biases in terms of our expectations of the sector and also how we design policy and we engage with the sector. So I'm suggesting here that in terms of that example of not-for-profits should not make a profit, it results in a reality where comprehensive costs of service delivery are not covered in government pricing, where there's improper indexation to government pricing, which has really become a very significant issue in this country over the last couple of years with very high CPI impacts. But also there is limited capital raising, non-competitive wages that are really coming to the fore with the workforce issues that we have in the country, and then a requirement to source top-up funding. So ultimately the outcome develops from this myth a cultural bias that informs policies inappropriately, which means then at the end of the day, if not-for-profits don't make a profit, they can't build their balance sheets, which means they can't reinvest to replace assets, but they can't invest in innovation, in developing their workforce and so on. So all of these issues are really important issues and outcomes from us having a basic misunderstanding of how the sector operates. At the end of the day, those myths and biases then translate into policy essentially that constrains not-for-profits and reduces that sustainability. Now, I hope that's relatively clear, but I'm really happy to, of course, to come back and talk about that a little bit more. But what are some of the examples of how this manifests in policy arrangements, but also in commentary around the not-for-profit and charitable sector in Australia particularly? So first of all, I mentioned before, one of the myths is that non-profits should not make a profit. And that has impacts in areas like not-for-profits not paying competitive salaries and creating very significant workforce issues for us. But also there's some more substantial myths that have been built up in the Australian community and culture that impact the way non-profits are perceived. And particularly non-profits are said to be inefficient and non-innovative. Now, I find that very, very difficult to understand how they can be inefficient, particularly when we consider the low wages that are paid in this sector, but also because people like directors and others are volunteers into the sector. In this country of 23 odd million people, our charity sector, for instance, deploys about 3.5 million volunteers a year. So there's a very significant input that goes into these services that is not paid for by government or philanthropists. But the other thing that particular culture drives in this country is that non-profits must learn from commerce. And I think this is a real misunderstanding about the nature of commerce versus the nature of the charitable sector, but also helps or drives what we call defensive decision making, where not-for-profits and charities have financial or other impacts and they defend their organisation rather than defending the systemic service delivery at a national level. It results in things like economic and competition, and it results in a misdirection of services where organisations pick the eyes out of service delivery programs to deliver those services that are financially viable, not deliver the services necessarily that are needed. The other big issue that we are doing a lot of work to fight against is that the non-profit sector is a fiscal sink. That means that at the end of the day, we are constantly barraged in the sector to drive for a reduction in expenses, to drive for a reduction in government expenditure. And while this is not really an effective way to move forward from the sector's perspective in terms of being able to capability build and to be able to be innovative and efficient in their own right, it also means, though, that there are certain economic outcomes that are not achieved because governments are thinking about what the cost of service delivery is and how we should reduce that. But because the not-for-profit sector employment cohort is so low paid, in fact, almost every dollar that is paid to staff within the not-for-profit sector in this country goes into consumption. So that at the end of the day, when we have things like COVID, Asian financial crisis, global financial crises, and so on, this sector is actually a prime sector for priming the pump in terms of putting money into the sector to go straight to wages, which goes straight to that consumption. At the end of the day, I think that fiscal issue also drives into governments saying they don't have enough money and to resource the sector properly. And proper resourcing means sustainability, not just in the short term, fiscal sustainability, but also into the medium and longer term to be able to replace and innovate the sector to be able to build its capacity over time. So together with non-profit sector as a fiscal sink, I think this is a really significant issue that we face in the Australian context, because we actually have about 12 governments that deliver on these services. Our local government sector is not so involved, but our states and territories, as well as the Commonwealth government, the national government, are in the grip of this particular way of thinking. The final or next to final element, penultimate element I wanted to raise in terms of myths and misunderstandings relating to this sector are, as you can see here, that competition in markets create efficiency and effectiveness. Since Margaret Thatcher, one of your greatest exports or most effective exports to the globe, came to power, Australia, like many countries, has been in the grips of new public management, and we're no less in the grips of that today than we were when Margaret Thatcher was around 30 or 40 years ago. But at the end of the day, one of the most significant ways that this paradigm exposes itself is in the use of what we call quasi-markets. So using market terminology and market ideas to try and drive this apparent efficiency and effectiveness. And we've done a lot of work in this area to identify that quasi-markets simply don't work. Collaboration is a much more important idea in achieving outcomes in this sector than are competitive arrangements. That's not to say that competitive arrangements aren't useful in some areas, but certainly our research demonstrates quite categorically that the idea of the introduction of quasi-markets means that very significant sustainability issues are built into systems here. I guess that then goes hand in hand with the idea that all funds must be spent on programs, which is a really important issue, because that really leaves our sector with the cultural expectation that it is going to be sacrifice and selfishness that is always the characteristic of the sector. The sector should never have enough money or should never have enough resources to be able to do what it needs to do, and that volunteers and others should put in to be able to ensure sustainability of services going forward. You can probably tell by the tenor of my voice that I hold significant objections to all of these ideas, because I don't think they really build a strong sector. I don't think they build strong systems, but at the end of the day, the impact is worn by those shock absorbers of the system, those service users that are reliant on the system. How does some of these unintended consequences then manifest? Well, I think under-resourcing is a fairly obvious one in fiscal terms. We all know that the not-for-profit and charitable sector is often struggling to pay its bills as and when it becomes due. But what we do know increasingly have evidence for and are in having the impact of is the fact that the sector is simply unable to invest. It can't innovate, and it can't, most importantly, analyse its performance in terms of its operations and the way it works. Those kinds of things cost a lot of money and need to be part of the cost structure associated with program implementation in order to ensure that the sector becomes sustainable in the medium and longer term. And I guess just going back to my comments around the recent economic history of Australia, at the end of the day, we have been talking about these particular issues for a long time in this country, for probably upwards of 20 years at least, but it has been the recent 3 or 5 years of economic outcomes that have really brought them to the fore, that have made them manifest and actually crystallise as major issues. I mentioned before that quasi-markets have also significant policy downfalls and have very significant impacts on sustainability, causing service failure and also increased public cost. Service failure occurs because we have a situation where competition and market economics drives the way boards are thinking, and often our boards are populated by people from commerce, and so they react defensively in the way that organisations do in commerce when there are downturns in economic outcomes. At the end of the day, it causes significant increases in public costs because services still need to be developed and presented. And I guess that causes a sustainability reduction, as you can see here, as a result of that defensive decision making, where organisations pull the plug on programs because they're not able to make sufficient funds to be able to ensure their own organisational sustainability. And I guess at the end of the day, the final element for me is around that lack of transparency then, and our misunderstanding of what's happening in terms of the service mix. It's not unusual in this country for organisations to go to their government departments that are funding them and to be told that if they are struggling financially, just simply reduce the number of services that they provide. Or for other government departments to talk in terms of quasi-markets and say, well, if the market doesn't deliver what you need, then simply don't deliver the service, which is not really all that encouraging for the sector, but it's really important culturally in terms of things like homelessness, disability services and aged care services. So at the end of the day, what does it mean for us from a policy development and practice perspective? I think we need to understand, and my first proposition was that we don't really understand the system, but we need to be developing data assets and analytical capacity to be able to understand the difference between demand and need in economics terms, and they are two different things, and also to be able to then analyse the extent to which we're achieving outcomes. So having service mix targets, so an industry plan to understand what the service mix is and what the targets of that service mix should be to meet need, is a really critical element. Transparency in those outcomes reportings is absolutely critical. So whether we've achieved our target mix, and if not, by how much, and also having then genuine collaboration between government and the sector. At the moment, government sets policy and then really procures services in a very commercial environment. We need to change that environment to make it much more collaborative, to be able to drive both service design, but also need understanding and data asset creation between the sector and government to be able to understand what's happening at that systemic level. So at the end of the day, I think there's a real critical need for us to understand the system and how the system hangs together, and to be able to have our policy operators, our peak bodies, so our sector leaders, to be able to appreciate what's really happening at a systemic level rather than an individual organisation level, to be able to drive much better outcomes from a sustainability perspective going forward. And again, as I mentioned, the economic history of Australia over the last 3 years has really brought these issues to a fore and made them very urgent in terms of being able to ensure that we can meet the needs of people in what is a really wealthy country, and a country where we've got a great culture for being able to undertake these kinds of activities, but a culture that doesn't support them simply because we have this built-up myths and misunderstandings driving the way we approach the sector and we create policy. So that's all I wanted to say. I think I've managed to say it within 3 minutes of my time frame, but I'm very happy to take questions and comments should there be any, and reiterate that these slides are available and I'm happy to chat outside of session as well. Thank you very much.